in my opinion, there was an ancient civilization or ancient species, whichever one you want to call it, which basically built the same type of structures all over the entire world, right? Whether that being in Japan, that being in Asia, that being in Russia, that being in Europe, South America, Africa, Mexico, United States, every single place has the exact same infrastructure. And, that relates into this whole Tartarian history, because when you look at these buildings, you see like these, they call them like Greco-Roman buildings or whatever else. You see this structure or this infrastructure everywhere, right? Every part of the world. And you sit there and wonder, well, if people were building like that all over the world, maybe they were also very united and connected, right? And we have a lot of disconnect going on with our history right now. They just make up our history and say whatever they feel. They give us the narrative of the traditional horses and wagons, right? Everybody was on horses and wagons, and they supposedly built all these beautiful structures. And when you look at the detail of these structures and how, just the curvature and how it's like etched, right? It almost looks like someone just drew into these buildings. You start to think like, how were they on a horse and a wagon? They didn't have, for example, let's say maybe a crane, or they didn't have these tools, or whatever it may be. They didn't even have electricity, supposedly, at that time. So you start to look at that and go, but they were building buildings that were like 10 stories high, that looked like castles, right? So when you get into Tartaria history and you start to look at all this, you see a lot of these buildings have been hijacked by basically a parasitic entity, in my opinion. So you'll see buildings like, maybe a mental institution, a hotel, a school, right? It might be a university, and they usually attach some funny story like, oh, this started in 1902, and, they always give you this date, right? 1903, whatever, but the building was there before that. And that's when you get into this whole Tartarian history, is a lot of this Tartaria itself was on the map, right? When you go to look at these old maps from the 1400s, 1500s, and 1600s, there were all areas of Tartaria, and they showed big castles, like massive castles on the map. So you look at this and go, okay, look at how big those castles are, and look at the shape of them, right? Some of them being in a star, right? Like a star fort and all of these things. And you sit there and think, okay, so a person on a horse and wagon, or a chariot and a horse, right? Because let's go with both narratives. They were building things that were shaped like stars and all different shapes that basically mimic the sky. In the water, in the middle of the ocean, in all these places that it just doesn't make a lot of logical sense. And this is when you start getting into this old world history, because that's what I consider it. It's old world history. When you start getting into this topic, you start seeing a lot of the storyline does not make sense of how some of these buildings were built. And, you start to look at that structure and go, I don't think that adds up. And then you add weather, then you need water, then you need food, right? Like, let's say this building is on top of a mountain, like Machu Picchu, which is stones perfectly put, stacked on top of each other, that are over 300 tons each stone, perfectly placed on top of a mountain. You start to think, how did they get that up there? And did they have food? Did they have water? Did their wagon wheel break, right? Because it's always that goofy story and whatever. How did their horses carry them up? We can, and it's funny because the one video I saw, which perfectly just summed it all up, was my buddy Larry put up a video where they took a rock, like a big boulder, and they put it in the back of the dump truck, and the dump truck completely tipped over. So you sit there and go, okay, we got all this advanced, building and construction that we're supposedly told, but one boulder on the back of a truck literally makes it flip. So then how did they move 500 of them, right? How did they cut them and perfectly put them into shapes and triangles and circles and stars and all these beautiful, beautiful designs? And not only that, but how did they do it out of metal, right? A lot of these old world buildings with the Tartaria thing are made out of copper, brass, and gold, right? So you're telling me they were sitting, making jewelry and designing these beautiful statues and structures out of gold and copper and brass and doing metal work while putting it up on top, while being on their horse and wagon, and then, doing all of that on top of it. You start to go, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. We've clearly been lied to.
Yeah, and it's like something doesn't add up, and we're trying to figure out why. Why would you hide that from us, right? I say knowledge is potential power, because if you have the knowledge, you got to do something with it, right? And now that we have established, you know, a little bit of what tartaria will signify in the brain, now that you know what it is, why haven't we heard about it?
So I think a lot of the reason we haven't heard about a lot of the stuff is related to technology, which is what you were describing. Because when you look at a lot of these old world buildings, they used to have these domes on top of them, right? And these domes were made out of copper, they were made out of brass, they were made out of certain materials. They also used to have brass balls on top of them that were fractal antennas that had mercury inside and could rotate, and they could pick up on the atmospheric energy that's up in the air, right? And they could also balance out the atmosphere, right? A lot of the lightning rods in which we were taught that lightning rods are to catch lightning, lightning rods are also used to balance out the atmosphere, right? You're pointing up towards the air as it spins, it's creating energy up into the air, and it's also creating energy down. You look at a lot of those old fireplaces that are in these, you know, these buildings as well. A lot of them had stuff with uranium, radium, you know, all these different precious metals. They could gather energy out of these fireplaces to basically have all their lights turn on, right? Like all these old gas lamps would basically be able to all snap on at a finger. Now remember, if all of that is possible out of a fireplace, right? Like let's just make it real simple, then you don't need natural gas, you don't need oil, you don't need this whole, you know, Rockefeller takeover of the energy system, right? You just would use what you already have, and based on the materials that are in your building, they also resonate at a frequency, right? They can be very healing. And when we look at a lot of, for example, the old world, like the cathedrals and all of these things, the pipe organs that used to play in those would emit certain frequencies to heal the entire body or structure the entire body instantaneously. So if you look at it between the technology over here, you have the energy on this side, right? And all of that, which we could learn about and go, oh, wow, I could do it all for next to nothing. That's number one, right? And then number two over here, you look at it at the healing standpoint and you go, okay, well, that would already decimate all of the system we have today, which is not healing people, it's making people more sick. So that would take care of that because we'd use sound frequencies. And then it would also open up our mind into the fact that this was all stuff that was maybe only 150 years ago. You know, that's one big one too, because, you know, a lot of these stories, right? We have a lot of these stories where it's, oh, you know, this was built 1 million and 50 million and 100,000. What happened if this was all built 150 years ago, right? And we are not paying attention because we have been told by the books, you know, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and whatever else, but there's no ships to show that. You know, we don't have the ships. We don't see the ships, right? And a lot of the story in which we've been told, we don't see any of that, right? There's none of the stuff in the museum. But the thing is this would also change our minds to maybe our past, right? Maybe that people were very connected, right? That's another thing, right? If these types of buildings were built all over the world, that means people were very connected, and that means they were very friendly, right? They weren't sitting fighting each other over things that they were telling us. And it's interesting too, because when you look at a lot of the armor that people used to wear, supposedly during the medieval times and all these things, those are all electrical conductors, right? When you wear that suit of armor, if I take your arm and I cover it with copper right now, and I put it up against your arm, this area starts to basically, it creates energy, but it also begins to heal, right? You begin to heal this area. So those suits of armor could be something that can also harness the atmospheric energy that's all around us, and that could also elevate your consciousness to a higher potential, right? Because if I took for example, an antenna and I placed it on top of my head, and I put a helmet on, and I put a full suit of armor on that supposedly they were using to, let's say, fight each other, you would start to gather energy like an antenna that we already are. So I feel like there's multiple different layers of why this information has been suppressed, because it opens up so many questions that even if you just question one narrative and just think, you know, that doesn't really make any sense, actually, I don't remember anybody fighting. All of a sudden, well then wait, what about all the other history you've been told, right? What about all the buildings when you go to the museum and the museum says, oh, this was done in, you know, 1702, and it's like, really? Well, what happened if they were very advanced in 1702 and they're just trying to show us a very primitive way that we actually weren't, right? It's stuff that we have to start questioning, because when you look at the details of these buildings and the all of this, these beautiful, just like things built out of sandstone that are like 500 feet high. You sit there and think somebody was very advanced, right? And it may have been us, but we have forgotten because they have taken advantage of our memory and brainwashed us into believing that all of this was so long ago. And it fits the narrative of it was millions of years ago when they were supposedly pulling things with ropes and doing stuff, like even in Egypt, right? They were tying ropes around it and pulling it. No, they weren't. They were very, very advanced, and they don't want the information.